We currently live in the most frictionless era in the history of human civilization. The modern world is a marvel of hyper-optimized consumerism, painstakingly engineered to remove every conceivable barrier between a sudden desire and its immediate fulfillment. Everything around us is designed as a black box, sleek, sealed, proprietary, and fundamentally opaque. You tap a piece of glass, and a hot meal arrives at your door. You click a button, and a pre-configured liquid-cooled supercomputer is shipped to your house. You swipe your thumb, and an algorithm curates your entire digital existence. For the vast majority of the population, this absolute removal of friction is considered a utopia. But there is a specific, deeply fascinating psychological profile of a person who views this frictionless utopia not as a paradise, but as a sensory deprivation tank for the mind. Have you ever looked at someone who spent 3 weeks, hundreds of dollars, and suffered through countless sleepless nights building their own custom mechanical keyboard, setting up a complex Linux home server rack, or writing a piece of open-source software, and thought, you could have just bought that on Amazon for $50, right? If you have ever asked a builder that question, you have likely been met with a blank, slightly pitied stare. Because to the builder, the tinkerer, the hardware hacker, and the open-source contributor, buying the finished product completely misses the point. They do not just want to use the world. They have a psychological, neurobiological, and evolutionary mandate to decompile it, reverse engineer it, and build it themselves. Today, we are going deep into the psychology of the builder. We are going to explore the hidden neurobiology of high-friction problem solving, the deep-seated evolutionary logic of the open-source gift economy, and why, for a certain type of brain, building things from scratch is not merely a hobby. It is an absolute cognitive necessity. To understand the builder, we first have to look at their baseline cognitive architecture. In the 1980s, psychologists Richard Petty and John Cacioppo introduced a concept known as the need for cognition, NFC. Need for cognition is defined as a personality variable reflecting the extent to which an individual is inclined towards and fundamentally enjoys effortful cognitive activities. People with a low need for cognition rely on cognitive heuristics, mental shortcuts, to navigate the world. They are perfectly happy trusting the manufacturer's settings. But a high NFC individual literally craves cognitive heavy lifting. Deprive them of complex, multivariable problems, and they become chronically bored and existentially restless. Coupled with this is a metric developed by cognitive neuroscientist Simon Baron-Cohen, known as the systemizing quotient, or SQ. Baron-Cohen posits that human brains exist on a spectrum between empathizing, the drive to identify another person's emotions and respond with appropriate affect, and systemizing. Systemizing is the relentless drive to analyze, explore, and construct rule-based systems. It is the desire to extract the underlying mechanics of a subject to see how it works. While a consumer looks at a smartphone and sees an intuitive interface, a high systemizer looks at that exact same phone and experiences a burning, almost aggressive curiosity. They see a complex hierarchy of logic gates, application programming interfaces, microcontrollers, and tightly packed lithium-ion cells. For the high systemizer, the unknown is deeply, physically uncomfortable. Operating a system without understanding its underlying mechanics feels equivalent to flying an airplane completely blind. Building something from scratch, whether that means soldering a custom drone frame, compiling a custom Linux kernel, or wiring a smart home ecosystem from raw components, is the ultimate exercise in cognitive closure. By placing every single transistor or explicitly writing every line of code, the builder forcefully eliminates the anxiety of the unknown. They transition from being a passive subject at the mercy of a piece of technology to a sovereign architect who has achieved absolute mastery over it. But this drive for mastery is not just a personality quirk. It is heavily fueled by a very specific, highly localized neurochemical loop that the builder becomes literally addicted to. We often assume that builders are motivated by the end product, the finished robot, the fully functioning application, or the perfectly tuned engine. But functional MRI scans of people engaged in complex, high-friction problem solving reveal something entirely different and highly counterintuitive. The true addiction of the builder is the micro-resolution of frustration. When a builder is trying to get a 3D printer to perfectly extrude a tricky filament, or they are debugging a script that refuses to compile, they enter a state of extreme cognitive friction. Cortisol, the stress hormone, begins to rise. Norepinephrine floods their system, narrowing their focus and heightening their alertness. Frustration builds. The brain is effectively winding up a biochemical spring. But the exact moment they find the error, the missing semicolon in the code, the loose solder joint on the motherboard, the microscopic misalignment in the gears, their brain releases a hyper-concentrated, phasic burst of dopamine. This is fundamentally different from the passive, dull, tonic dopamine release you get from scrolling social media or eating junk food. This is deeply engaged, effort-based dopaminergic firing. It is the exact chemical reward mechanism that kept our hunter-gatherer ancestors tracking prey for days across hostile terrain. Simultaneously, as the builder sinks deeper into the project, they achieve a state of flow, famously identified by psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. Neurobiologically, flow is characterized by a phenomenon called transient hypofrontality. Transient means temporary, hypo means less, and frontality refers to the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the part of your brain responsible for your sense of self, your perception of time, and your inner critic. During intense building and troubleshooting, the brain literally shuts down the prefrontal cortex to reroute processing power to the parts of the brain handling spatial awareness and logic. This is why a programmer or an engineer can sit down at 8 p.m. to fix a quick bug and suddenly realize the sun is coming up. Their perception of time and their ego have been chemically deleted. Furthermore, during this state, the brain releases anandamide, an endocannabinoid literally named after the Sanskrit word for bliss, which facilitates lateral thinking and pattern recognition. The builder's brain essentially becomes hijacked by the process of troubleshooting. The French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss coined the term bricolage to describe this exact behavior, the act of creating something from a diverse range of available things, driven by the pure, intrinsic joy of problem solving. For the builder, the friction isn't a barrier to the work. The friction is the work. To understand why this psychological profile is becoming more prevalent and more intense today, we have to look at the socio-economic reality of modern work. In the 19th century, philosopher Karl Marx introduced the theory of alienation and Fremdung. Marx observed that the Industrial Revolution had profoundly damaged the human psyche by disconnecting the worker from the product of their labor. Before industrialization, a cobbler conceptualized a shoe, sourced the leather, cut the material, stitched it together, and handed the final, tangible product to a customer. The cobbler's identity and psychological worth were directly tied to the physical output. But in modern, hyper-specialized corporate environments, we are deeply alienated. A modern worker might spend 60 hours a week adjusting cells in a spreadsheet, attending Zoom meetings, or optimizing a microscopic back-end process for an app they don't own, for a user they will never meet. The brain, which evolved to manipulate physical matter to ensure survival, is left feeling utterly hollow, performing abstract tasks that yield no tangible physical result. This is where the psychology of the builder acts as a radical subconscious rebellion. Building your own PC, coding your own game, or restoring an old motorcycle is the ultimate cure for modern alienation. The builder is reclaiming the entire life cycle of production. They are forcefully reconnecting the mind, the hand, and the material world. When a software engineer comes home from a sterile corporate job and spends 5 hours physically wiring an LED array for a custom terrarium, they are not wasting time. They are engaging in psychological self-medication. They are proving to their ancient primate brain that they still possess the ability to manipulate the physical environment and manifest a thought into reality. Part 4. The psychology of ownership, effort justification, and the IKEA effect. This deep connection to the self-made object leads us to a fascinating behavioral economics principle known as effort justification, or more colloquially, the IKEA effect. Coined by researchers Michael Norton, Daniel Motion, and Dan Ariely, the IKEA effect is a cognitive bias wherein individuals place a disproportionate, highly inflated value on products they partially created, regardless of the objective quality of the end result. In a classic experiment, Ariely had participants fold origami cranes. He then asked them how much they would pay to buy their own origami versus how much they would pay for origami folded by a professional expert. The participants consistently valued their own amateur, crinkled, objectively inferior origami higher than the flawless professional versions. But for the true builder, the IKEA effect is operating on absolute steroids. This ties directly into self-determination theory, SDT, which states that human psychological well-being is driven by three basic, non-negotiable needs: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. When you buy a lockdown piece of hardware from a massive tech conglomerate, you have zero autonomy. You are essentially renting an experience designed by a corporation. You are a guest in their walled garden. But when you build your own system, even if the fan is a little loud, even if the code occasionally crashes, and even if it looks like a mess of wires, it fulfills the psychological need for absolute autonomy. If it breaks, you do not have to call a customer support hotline or make an appointment at a Genius Bar. You tear it open and fix it yourself, which radically fulfills the need for competence. The psychological ownership of a self-built system creates a profound, unshakable sense of self-reliance that a consumer can simply never buy off a shelf, no matter how much money they spend. But if we accept that builders derive intense psychological value, ownership, and competence from their creations, how do we explain the most baffling, illogical part of the builder psychology, the open source paradox? Why do brilliant software engineers, hardware designers, and systems architects spend thousands of agonizing hours building incredibly complex, vital systems only to upload them to GitHub or open source hardware forums for absolutely free? They surrender their intellectual property, allow strangers to modify their work, and demand zero financial compensation. In a strictly capitalist framework, driven by self-interest and profit maximization, this behavior makes absolutely zero mathematical sense. To solve this paradox, we have to abandon modern economics and look toward evolutionary biology and early human sociology, specifically the concept of the gift economy and costly signaling theory. For the vast majority of human history, status within a tribe was not determined by how much you could hoard, but by how much you could afford to give away. The French sociologist Marcel Mauss extensively studied a phenomenon among indigenous tribes called the potlatch, a ceremonial feast where leaders gained prestige and social dominance through extreme acts of communal generosity, often giving away or destroying their most valuable possessions. In the digital age, open-source communities are the ultimate meritocratic modern tribes. When a builder writes an incredibly elegant piece of code, designs a highly efficient circuit board, or creates an extensive library, and then open sources it, they are engaging in the digital equivalent of a potlatch. According to evolutionary biologist Amatz Zahavi's handicap principle, organisms often evolve behaviors that are costly to themselves as a reliable signal of their genetic fitness. The peacock's massive tail makes it vulnerable to predators, but it signals to mates, "I am so healthy and strong that I can survive even with this massive handicap." Open sourcing complex work is a modern evolutionary handicap. It is an ultimate intellectual flex. The builder is signaling to the global tribe, "I am so exceptionally skilled, my cognitive resources are so vast, and my survival in the marketplace is so secure that I can afford to give this incredibly valuable labor away for free." Furthermore, this extreme generosity perfectly fulfills that third pillar of self-determination theory, relatedness, by contributing to a massive open source project, like the Linux kernel, which literally runs the servers that power the modern internet. The individual builder becomes immortalized as part of a collective superorganism. They are trading monetary compensation for something vastly more powerful and ancient to the human psyche: legacy, peer respect, and irrefutable tribal belonging. To summarize the psychology of the builder, they are not just hobbyists wasting their time on inefficient, overly complicated projects. They are individuals with a distinct cognitive architecture, a high systemizing quotient, and a deep need for cognition, who require a fundamental understanding of their environment to feel secure. Their brains are neurologically wired to extract intense, dopaminergic rewards not from passive consumption, but from the high-friction, deeply frustrating process of debugging, tinkering, and problem-solving. They build to cure the existential alienation of the modern world, forcefully reclaiming their autonomy and competence in a society of locked black boxes. And they share their brilliant creations for free because they understand that true status and immortality are not found in hoarding knowledge, but in giving it away to elevate the tribe. The next time you see someone tearing apart a perfectly good, functioning piece of technology just to see how it works, or spending an entire weekend writing code that already exists commercially, do not ask them why they didn't just buy it. Because to the builder, the act of creation is not about the final product. The final product is just a byproduct. The true purpose of the build is to prove to themselves, in a world that increasingly wants them to sit still and consume, that they still have their hands firmly on the steering wheel of reality.